All right. Thank you, Kajungu, and welcome all to our webinar. Again, I want to apologize for some of the technical difficulties. I think we're ready to go here, and we want to just say a few remarks as part of the welcome. This webinar series, we want to acknowledge, has been funded by a grant from the Virginia Foundation for Humanities, and so we appreciate that funding, and you will note that our case studies and our discussion around transforming historical harms is located in the Virginia State area. With that in mind, we want to look at just one announcement here before we go into the topic for the day, and that is to let folks know, those of you who were part of the webinar in September will remember a fantastic webinar with Dr. David Anderson Hooker on transformative community conferencing. We're making available an opportunity for you to interact with much more depth and drill deeper into this process and the skill sets and competencies that come with that, with David Anderson Hooker himself in a residential training for the weekend of Friday, February 16th and Saturday, February 17th in the spring 2018 here at Eastern Mennonite University. So welcoming you. If you felt like that was just a teaser and want to go into more depth, you have another opportunity to do that in February. All are welcome. Today's webinar is promising to be another great one, and we're looking forward to getting into the conversation here very soon. We'll be looking at truth-telling on race relations in the U.S. context. That's quite a broad topic, and we're going to keep it somewhat broad, but we're also going to hone into a special case study around the Maine Wabanaki TRC, and we'll be hearing more detail around that from our guest speaker, Dr. Thalia González. And welcome, Thalia. It's really great to have you with us. Just for those who are out there in our webinar, let me give you a little brief summary of Dr. Thalia González's work. She's a senior visiting scholar at the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown University Law Center. She's also associate professor of law and politics at the Occidental College. She's on leave currently in this work with Georgetown. Her research and teaching interests are broad and very, very important. She centers on contemporary questions at the intersection of law, politics, inequality, systemic reform, and special focus, and why we have her here, on restorative justice, juvenile justice, and civil and human rights. Thalia's work is nationally recognized. She's done a lot of work in school-based restorative justice and issues around disproportionality, the school-to-prison pipeline, and restorative practices, and how educators, policymakers, and county safety councils, think tanks, and bar associations are using restorative justice in a broader application. She has published extensively in various reviews and journals, which you will see stated there. And so it's just a real privilege to have Dr. Thalia González with us. And thank you for taking the time to be with us, Thalia. We really appreciate it. Let me just remind those who are in the webinar, as Kajungu said, if you've got questions, please type them out through the chat function, and I will be keeping track of those questions so that when we come to the question and answer time, there'll be ample time to engage with your questions for Thalia. All right. With that, welcome, Thalia, and I'll open it up for you to make any opening comments you'd like to, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Great. So, well, good afternoon for those of you, depending where you're located. I'm currently in LA right now. And good evening, I imagine, for some of you in this other context. I absolutely want to thank the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice for the invitation to explore this conversation. And I think in particular jump into looking at a very rich but often less explored area, which is the Maine Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, I think that it's incredibly significant. It offers a lot of deep insights, as well as sort of where we might take this conversation in the future, and bringing it into conversation with a larger racial justice and truth-telling lens, I think, is really important. We have a short video that we want to show, and we'll do that in a second, but I do really want to acknowledge something I think is important. I am a non-native researcher, and I'm going to be speaking about the work in a Native community and with Native people, the Wabanaki people. And so I'm deeply grateful for that opportunity, and the reason that I have this opportunity is because there has been a really important sharing of the documents of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, as well as the space that I've been given by being able to have conversations with the executive director. And so I think it's really important as a restorative justice practitioner, as a researcher, as a social justice advocate, to recognize all of the ways that we think about this work. And so I wanted to kind of elevate that. So Carl's going to go ahead and start the video, which will give us a little bit of history, though we'll dig in deeper and again, bring voices into this conversation that I think are really significant.
When you talk about termination era policies of boarding schools and the Indian Adoption Act and all those things that took our children and in some cases forcibly put them in non-native homes, subjected them to environments of abuse. Really something that needs to be talked about with a good, honest conversation, but we need to do that in the spirit of not blaming, but this is what happened. How do we move forward to assure that these things never happen again?
For the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's meant to help Maine and Wabanaki governments move forward together.
To go through this process that I have been able to do some healing around what happened. I can hold my children even though they're adults, and I can hold them and I can tell them that I love them, truly feel love for them. And I wasn't able to do that before. We're going to work with our communities and we're all going to start the conversation about what happened. People will come forward and tell their stories to the Truth Commission. Families of these individuals will come forward also to tell their stories. The children who were affected by those of us in foster care. We will not only heal as families and be able to change and deconstruct the trauma, but I think we can heal as communities.
Earlier, my best hope for this is that it has widespread impact. Of course, I hope that there is healing for those that have been harmed in the past. That's important to us. For the staff that I oversee, my hope is that there's widespread understanding of what the history was, what the truth of the history was, so that they never repeat even a bit of it. That's my hope.
Ideally, with this Truth and Reconciliation Commission focusing on Indian child welfare, I think what my ultimate goal is to have a full understanding in the state of what happens when a child from our tribe or from any of the tribal nations in Maine are displaced, what that process looks like, how they're supposed to be dealt with, and their cultural ties and their tribal affiliation is always the most important thing on that agenda. My hope is that this can become the model in all areas for how to sit down and truly try to understand the tribal perspective, as well as us understanding where the state's coming from.
All right. Thalia, I'll let you take it from here. Maybe what you can help us with to start off is just briefly describe how did this is the second, I believe, TRC, official TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States. How did this Maine Wabanaki TRC come into being? Can you give us some of the background, the backstory to that?
Sure, absolutely. I just want to make sure folks can hear me because I got a message that you couldn't hear me very well. So if you can't hear me and you send a little chat in so someone sees it, that would be great. I feel like I'm yelling, and I'm sure maybe the people next to me in their offices think I am, but I want to make sure that you can hear what I'm saying. So Carl, the short answer is relationships. And so, I think it's important that we recognize there wouldn't have been a possibility of, oh good, thank you, Anne. I appreciate that you shared that with me, that you could hear me. This is helpful for feedback. There wouldn't have been a possibility of developing or undertaking any Truth or Reconciliation Commission if there hadn't been a history of collaboration and collective understanding. And that doesn't mean that collective understanding was always about harm or trauma, but that there was something that was already built in existence. So if you saw on the slide, there was a reference to 1999. And so I'll jump through a bit of a timeline because I think that's helpful for folks to get a depth of what this looked like. But more importantly, it was never, having a commission, having a process, having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was never viewed as an event. It was never viewed as a one-time process to complete. And I think that also speaks to sort of how it came into being and how it moved forward. So in 1999, there was a working group that was created between non-Native and Native child welfare workers to come together to think about compliance around the Indian Child Welfare Act. And that group was really just tasked with, as we think about many of our working groups where there's these state partners that are coming together, compliance, training, data. Right? There was never anything that was talking about historic harm. There certainly wasn't cultural genocide sort of thrown in as a language. But what happened is that over almost a decade, as that group was working, what they realized is that history mattered and truth mattered. And so that the truth had to be elevated about the experiences that Wabanaki people, families, and communities were having within the child welfare system, both in terms of on a healing side, but also to learn from the past about what had worked and to understand then the future. And I think that's important because that's a theme that goes throughout, that this was never just, again, sort of one event. It was always future looking. And so that working group starts coming together and a couple of things happen simultaneously. There's a local family fund that starts to provide resources to think about what it might be to support the truth and reconciliation process. And caseworkers start to elevate their own stories and tell their own stories about painful removal and assimilation and the impact on family and children. So you start to really have a more open dialogue that isn't just focused on compliance. And then 2 years later, so in 2010, so you can see kind of why I'm laying out some dates, because it's happening over a long period of time relationally. In 2010, that group then says, it sends an invitation to the Maine Department of Children and Family Services to think about actually writing a declaration of intent. So kind of taking that next step, and that really is a full decade later in kind of elevating these issues. That declaration of intent is modeled after the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the Mississippi Truth Project. So again, looking to the outside to then think about what might work locally and how it can be realized in that context. A year later, and we saw this in the video, the declaration of intent is signed by the 5 Wabanaki chiefs, as well as the Maine governor. And I am not from Maine, but as I have spent time researching this, it is not a governor. Governor LePage is not a California governor, we'll say. He's not, viewed as an incredibly progressive governor. And so I think that's important to recognize that the dynamics were there, the history was there, the understanding the relationships were there enough to push this forward, and that people thought that it was significant enough to not just name the truth, but then to think about reconciliation in that way. A year later, in 2012, we then see a true mandate, and it has 3 distinct purposes. And I think this is also important because it wasn't just about truth, it was about healing, and then it was about change. So there really were those 3 components that were built in together. And it sets forth a timeline that tells us that this is to look at from 1978, which is the passage of ICWA, to the present. And as we saw in the video as well, it was also very clear that it was about what are all the other relationships that could be impacted by this process around this small issue, and that it would be relational, systemic, and cultural. And then the commission gets seated in 2013, and we have a final report in 2015 to kind of build that out. So, I hope that gives a little bit of depth and backstory so that people think about this evolution not just as, oh, suddenly one day a Truth and Reconciliation Commission sounded like a good idea, but more importantly, that it was an easy process. It was a long, it was a deliberate, it was a thoughtful process. It was a collaborative process. It was built around existing relationships and recognizing what really needed to be unearthed was a truth and narratives to move forward.
Thank you, Thalia. I'm resonating with that. That's really important backstory. And I appreciate the emphasis you're making there, because I think one of our problems is this sort of sense that we can just declare a truth commission and everyone will jump in. And this whole relational thing is critical, not only to restorative justice as we know it, but yeah, we're not going to come to consensus unless there's a lot of work on the ground in preparation. And we talk about that preparation in any of our restorative justice processes, even if you're talking about circle and basic processes between a small group of people, there's a lot of preparation in that. And clearly for something like this, it's going to take that kind of relational building. And also I'm really happy to hear about the sort of mandate being more than truth telling, even though truth telling is really core. It's not, as I often say, truth itself is not healing. It's what we do with the truth. So that sort of truth, healing, and change is a fascinating tripartite sort of way of saying, how can we make this more whole? Very nice. Tell us some more about the unique aspects that emerged in this process and what makes this something notable. And I mean, it's notable just on its own, but what are we seeing that you would say make this a unique process for those of us trying to understand the case in more depth?
Sure. I mean, I think, of course, the longstanding relationships are a unique process, and the fact that you could start with a working group, have that working group then become the convening group, right? And actually not just draft, but then a convening group for the whole commission. And then ultimately that group and that cross-cultural coalition became a strategic partner when they evolved into Maine Wabanaki Reach. And I can talk about Reach a little bit further, but I think that's really important, that the relationships were there to be able to also grow that in that journey, so that it didn't feel as if people came in only at certain points in the process. There was a level of investment. I think that was also really important in recognizing that it was and what's unique is that it was a state-to-state collaboration. So issues of tribal sovereignty were very much embedded in it, and that's not certainly going to be the case in every endeavor around truth-telling. But there was also a community state collaboration. And I think that is an essential and key element to thinking about how truth-telling emerges, but then more importantly, that recognition and that sense of agency in the process, and that there's political power. And it wasn't just transactional in nature, it was very grassroots oriented. So I think the uniqueness then is also that they were able to take what felt like a sort of familiar model, right? A Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that yes, there have been an example in the United States, but most examples happen outside of the United States, co-create a process that addressed a very local and specific harm. The removal of children, the breaking apart of families and tribes, that cultural genocide that was occurring for Wabanaki people is not necessarily something that you would put in the context of, oh, it went soft again, I've been told to lean forward. That you would always be able to just say, well, let's replicate. And so that uniqueness. But then it was very much about injustice. It was very much about intergenerational harm. And it was very much about how to then heal from that. And that it wasn't going to happen overnight. And I think that aim of forgiveness and reconciliation, but with the knowledge that there wasn't an end game, was also very unique. But I do want to kind of give a bit more of a specific example in thinking about the convening group, because I think the convening group throughout its evolution gave a model to how people understood the process might unfold if there was a movement towards an actual commission. Because that convening group, it wasn't just that those individuals had been working together, and not everyone was obviously part of that over the full decade plus, but that they really grounded themselves in this fundamental principle of truth, right? That truth had to be squarely faced, no matter what that truth looked like. That had to be discussed openly, and in that group, as you look at the documents and as you talk with people, that was very challenging. That it had to be documented very thoroughly. So why a commission and an ultimate report made sense, and that it then had to be acknowledged officially. And so everyone was coming from that shared understanding, which became so essential that you had a collective understanding and a will to move forward in that way, in this state-to-state relationship, in this community-to-state relationship in that way. And again, that's because people had been working on this issue for such a long period of time, but they hadn't always been talking about it in this way. So the convening group became this really important microcosm to showcase to the outside community of what the possibility would be to talk about race, privilege, subordination, oppression, right? All of these factors, sovereignty, decolonization, so that when the commission moved forward and that work was there, that it wasn't the first time that people had to wrestle and struggle with these deep ideas, right? And these very challenging moments where an individual is sharing something that is so painful, and then the others around them are listening in a true and authentic way. And so, that co-creation of that process, that ability to model what that looked like over their deliberative work, I think is so essential. And it was grassroots. So that space of accountability was very grassroots. That care and attention was so critical. And it's really interesting when you read people's reflections about the drafting process of just the declaration of intent. It's very much that they desired to showcase how they work together to better suggest what it might look like when it was out in the public space. So I think all of those things are very instructive to other endeavors, but also extremely unique to the Wabanaki experience.
So it feels like, yeah, two things I'm hearing you say. There was a framework that emerged over the relationship building time, which was critical, so that framework was somewhat consensual and pieces of it were being heard. Maybe a question would be, over that relationship building time, how was that process being documented to the public? If you get what I'm saying, before the, I don't know if that makes sense to you. You know, in other words, how was the public seeing this process unfolding, or in particular ways?
So because the members of the convening group and the working group were all embedded in the community. So if you recall, it's Wabanaki child welfare workers. So they are very much embedded in the community. There's a public sense of identity and ownership over narratives, over stories, over truth. And so it wasn't being publicly documented in the sense of, you know, there's web pages that have
Right.
everyone's discussions or recordings of that, but it was being brought forth and talked about on a regular basis. And the truth is the same on the state side. And I think we saw that really quickly in the video, that even at the top level of the Maine Office of Children and Family Services, there was an engagement in what these questions were. So there was inter-staff dialogue separate from the process of drafting the Declaration of Intent, right? Separate from, you know, conversations about compliance, separate from moving forward with the Truth Commission. So on both sides, there really was this openness and this transparency about trying to move forward collectively. And I think that's different because there's, I think a lot of times, and rightfully so, there's an assumption that government involvement is going to mean that it's co-opted, there's appropriation, or somehow there's it's delegitimate. And I think in this instance, that it was so transparent, that it was built on the capacity and power sharing of all of these individuals in this way, and that everyone had that genuine seat, not just at the table, but in co-creating and designing this. It made it different than I think a lot of other endeavors we could imagine. Does that fully answer kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure there's more questions that are coming out, and folks, feel free to start putting those together and send them our way. Talk to me about, I mean, so much of what we've heard is the collaboration, and I'd love to hear a little bit more around how you saw that collaboration and how the folks involved saw it, and what was so critical about it. I mean, I think we're beginning to understand, especially with all this conversation around movement building and so on, this collaborative model is going to be critical, not only for, you know, in the past, we've known it's critical for activism and organizing and mobilizing, but also for collective healing and collective change. And so talk to us a little bit more about that collaborative element of this work, if you don't mind, Thalia.
Absolutely, and I think pivoting to the role that Maine Wabanaki Reach played is a great example of that. And so Reach actually stands for reconciliation, engagement, advocacy, change, and healing. So at the outset, the group of individuals that and the bodies that were convened together in the working group that became the convening group ultimately transformed into a cross-cultural coalition of even more organizations that had that commitment to reconciliation, to engagement, to advocacy, change, and to healing. And I think the engagement and advocacy is sort of the place that I want to focus on, because, you know, we're thinking about those other areas. So what that meant on the ground, literally during the process of the commission's work, is that they advised the commission on implementing truth-seeking activities in a manner that was consistent and directed by Maine Wabanaki people. The commission actually note this in the report, that Reach was a vital partner. Of course, they caveat and say they didn't, you know, write any of this report, you know, they weren't directing us, but I think they were so clear to understand that you had to have that really sincere grassroots level. And it's not just grassroots in name, it was also in all of the activities. because they were going out into the community and providing the education to both Native and non-Native people, service providers, doing visits with policymakers, with all kinds of community members throughout the state about the history of Maine, about the Wabanaki people, about how history contributes to cultural genocide, to intergenerational trauma, and what the potential was for reconciliation. So they were convening all of these conversations and bringing people together in that way, just to even have this commission be able to do the work that it was doing. So again, at this very grassroots level. They were also the ones that prepared communities for visits during the process of collecting narratives for the commission. And I think that's really important because they also provided the care and visible supports, both in one-on-one meetings. Sorry, I just saw someone popping up about joining in. It's very distracting sometimes. So they were doing community visits, they were doing one-on-one meetings, and they also did peace and healing circles after. So the aftercare that's associated when when voices were being heard, when stories were being told, and what it was to lift up that experience and that trauma, it was never viewed as you share your story, it's part of this formal process, and then that's it, right? It was very much this community-based, this very collaborative, this very much embedded in the healing aspect of this as well in lifting up truth. And they used the materials by Dr. Maria Yellowhouse Braveheart, and she looks at adverse childhood experiences, resiliency building, and traditional healing practices to understand historical trauma and healing strategies. And so they were also very deliberate in ensuring that that was so much of the work that they were doing. They advised state and tribal workers, they on all kinds of different practices. Then they started the work with youth. So they were also very keen to think about this from an intergenerational standpoint and working with Wabanaki youth and non-Native youth to ensure that truth and history was out there. So it wasn't just about the work that the commission was doing and that this was a separate initiative, but that really how do we ensure a clarity of understanding around history. And I know that was referenced in the video, but I don't think it's always that we're ensuring that our youth and our future generations have that sense of appreciation, because it takes a number of generations before we might actually see a difference in our cultural and social and political norms as emphasized through the work of a commission. So kind of doing that work in that way. And then they've gone through a whole set of evaluative processes. So, they've looked at the findings, they've looked at the recommendations, and again, the real work begins after any of these processes end. So I don't think anyone had an illusion that by doing the commission that this would all be resolved. And in fact, this is where the challenge has really been picked up by everyone. And since the completion of the final report, they've also created gatherings that are statewide gatherings where Wabanaki people and others who are committed to wellness can come together. And what's really unique is that it's a gathering that has a whole sort of range and dynamics of presentations, discussions, and workshops. But at their core, they're focused on four things, right? History, decolonization, resilience, and healing. So again, bringing through these essential components and these really difficult topics, right, that are so deeply personal, recognizing that it's one thing for a truth to be out there. It's another thing to have a sincere apology. It's another to accept that apology and have forgiveness. But then what is it to have that final step of being able to resolve that grief or those open wounds? And I think that these gatherings, as I look at them, and again, I'm not speaking for anybody else, but as I look at them, they start to be in that final place. And that doesn't mean there's been conclusion. It doesn't mean that everything that has been lifted up in all the voices of the commission's report, or in all the voices that were included in the commission's report and shared, that that's all been resolved and healed, but at least I think it's that first step. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. This is fascinating. I hope folks are grabbing onto some things they want to put some questions into. Thalia, in the last few bits, talk about some of the lessons you would say I mean, there's a lot already here that you've said are lessons we should be learning, but maybe there's some more you would say, you know, for instance, if someone was to say, what can we take from this experience to other parts of this country, let's say, when we think about historical truth-telling of historical harms? What would be your list there? I mean, you've done so many incredible bits here. I mean, I'm just thinking history, decolonization, truth-telling, and healing, and how important that is. Talk to me about some of the, you know, what you would think the primary lessons learned are.
Well, I think, you know, I think one of the key lessons learned, it's probably an overarching one, is that reconciliation is much about systemic change as it is about individual change, right? We recognize that there's individual change in terms of beliefs and values and attitudes, but what is it to marry a focus on truth and a focus on healing with then an ultimate outcome of change? And I think that having a directive that set that forth at the beginning is really important, and that's something that can then be not lifted per se and just put somewhere else, but can be a lesson and maybe a guide to other communities where this work is emerging in a different and local context. I think the second is that it has to be a local context. So it must have an identity that is local, and it must be participatory, because if as I've talked to everyone, I think what you recognize is that it was very much embedded in a local experience, not just the local experience of Wabanaki people in terms of the removal of children from their homes, right? And that forced removal and that appropriation and that cultural assimilation. But it was also these larger sort of themes in that way. But that was very local, and there was a sense of shared identity, but that the goal was to have that extend into a whole different set of relations. And so, you know, I think recognizing truth in the local context becomes so important. Mm-hmm. I think third, it was that, you know, is that this really shares with us that if we uncover truth, we also uncover its multiple forms. And I know we've had the opportunity to talk about that before, Carl, but it is that healing truth, it is that social truth, right? It is that political truth. And how can each of those truths guide us as we move forward into the future? I would say another lesson is that it brings people together that have perhaps felt that they were in isolation. And I think that's an important aspect of truth-telling, but also what truth-telling activities might be and what they are in our national context. You know, so if we're thinking about this as a national movement towards healing, if we're thinking about a national movement towards naming and truth-telling around historic harm, how do we have everyone that might feel that they're operating in isolation or have experiences in isolation now be bound together in a sense of collective identity, which I think gives power in an incredibly different way. And it gives an ownership and it gives an agency over truth. And I think from a very emancipatory framework. And so I think that's sort of another key sort of lesson learned that came out of the Wabanaki experience. Because there were many people, and even though the commission acknowledged in a report that they didn't talk to everybody that they would have liked to, there's many people that as children were adopted out and were no longer in the state of Maine. We're not even any longer in this country because of movement between Maine and Canada and the proximity, but they had heard about the initiative, they'd heard about the work of the commission, and they felt an invitation to be part of that. And so I think that is really important in that, one, you want to acknowledge that you may not be able to capture everyone's voice, but what is it to bring voices in that would have otherwise been absent? And I think that's a really salient learning piece. On the side of challenges, because this is not all rosy, yep. This wasn't perfect. It's not perfect now. You know, I think the commissioners were really key to point out a couple things, is that they had worked under a really short time frame, 27 months. 27 months, I know I can accomplish a lot of things in 27 months, which is just slightly over 2 years, but I'm not sure I could capture a full and accurate history from 1978 to now, right? And yet that's what they were tasked with across the state, across the people, across the community. and doing that, I think, in thoughtful, attentive, and authentic ways, and in culturally competent ways. So I think, if you're looking at a lesson learned and what this tells us for both a national movement or for localized emerging areas, or where there's already a really robust practice of truth, is to think about what is the time frame that you set, because you want a time frame, but how do you do that in a way that kind of navigates those difficulties? And I think something that was really unique to the Wabanaki experience, but should be considered in other communities, is language. Everyone who shared stories was invited to do so either in their native language or in English. And most people opted to do it in English. But I think the commissioners, rightfully so, highlighted the fact that how you speak in a non-native language and how you describe things that are deeply personal is going to be different. And so how do we navigate these nuances and differences around language when we're talking about historic harm with people? And even to the extent that that means that in different parts of this country, even if everyone is speaking English, right, there's not always a shared understanding and a collective identity about a word. And so how do we become really thoughtful and deliberate about understanding the words that people are choosing as they're describing harm and as they're describing trauma, and as we're thinking about this from a historical perspective? So I think all of those are kind of these lessons that should be lifted up, both on the side of, well, this is a really positive way of structure and form, but also what it might mean, in the future. And of course, I can't underscore relationships enough. If you haven't built capacity, if there isn't a social and political will, if there isn't, if people are not empowered to be part of this process and co-create, I think that there's a real chance of failure. And so I think that has to be given a sense of importance. And I don't just say that as someone who works in a restorative justice space and very much thinks through restorative lenses.
Right. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. This is really useful. May I just have you, if you have any comments on future next steps, that would be great. Thalia, before we go into the questions that we have here.
Great. Well, I think, why I was so excited to share this experience, and what the Maine Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission looked like, at least in a snapshot, is that there is so much variance in truth telling, and that there are so many possibilities for what form that might take. And how do we now start to look, if we're moving towards the future, at different models and different practices? And not because as a movement we want to co-opt them, or as a movement suggests that one should be elevated over the other, but what are the lessons that we can draw from that, and how can we move forward? Because, even though many folks are skeptical, I think the time is now. I think we exist in a political and social reality that actually demands truth in a wholly different way. And not to suggest that we didn't have that 3 years ago or 5 years ago or even a year ago, but right now we have to be thinking about truth to heal historic harm, and we have to be elevating truth in such a key and critical way. And so it's about being creative. It's about being bold, right? It's about being open to how truth is positioned in this racial justice movement, in this space of historic harm, and ensuring that it is positioned in that space. Because, as I work as a lawyer, right, another hat that I put on, the racial justice community isn't always thinking about truth telling in the same way that you or I might be having that conversation, or others might be having that conversation. And certainly lawyers think about truth in a wholly different way. And so how do we start to put all of these pieces together in a way that I think there's not just a collective understanding, but this larger discourse really does support both the local identity and the local understanding of truth, but move forward into policy change, into social change in that sense of reconciliation and harm in that way. But it's participatory. Right? I think it has to be participatory. It has to be organized in, with, and by people in that community. And so, I think a national movement is amazing. I think, as Fania Davis has described some of the possibilities of having these centers, I'm so excited at that vision, but I also want at the same time to ensure that that sense of local ownership, that sense of this is the truth in the community, and this is why we've designed and moved forward in this way, that's also being bridged and lifted up. And I think it's also a call to action for philanthropy. Like there is no reason why funders that have a racial justice profile shouldn't be thinking about funding truth-telling activities. And I know that Kellogg has certainly made investments in that way, but I can think of quite a few others that have it, right? And so what is the social contract that foundations and philanthropy have to ensuring that we start to have truth-telling activities elevated? And if we are going to have these models that are more specific, like a commission, there are resources available to do that, because that was something that in Maine happened, not because they said because of government support, but because there was outside funding that was available to do all of this work over those 27 months. So I'll leave it at that because I see there's questions coming up and I'm excited.
That's great. So let's jump into some of those questions right now. You did a nice segue into the fact, and just so folks who might want to go back in our webinar series and find the webinar that we did with Dr. Fania Davis, talking about national truth-telling processes at that point, and a gathering that we had in Richmond in 2016, February 2016, of a group of national leaders looking at truth-telling and coming up with very much some of the same ideas, that this is going to be a localized process. And currently that's being mapped, and we could have some more discussion about that. But let's turn to the questions, because there's some great ones in here. You've probably talked to some of this, but maybe this will cue a little bit. One of the questions coming from Jessica: I would love to hear more about the clues or signs that indicated transformation was happening, or what signs that change was happening to impact change and healing was taking place. Few signposts, Thalia, in your mind that we're saying that marks transformation in this process that you maybe haven't talked about?
Sure. So I guess I want to make sure that, am I talking about it, Jessica, after the end of the commission's work in terms of the formal report, or during the time before that? So either before all of this, before a commission was ultimately convened, or once they were working?
So Jessica says during the time. So okay. As it was unfolding, how were you seeing transformation?
So I think that the key signposts were, one, that there was, I think first and foremost, that there was an evolution from thinking about compliance with a federal mandate, the Indian Child Welfare Act, to bringing history into conversation with that. And more importantly, positioning history as an essential element to talk about harm. So it wasn't just history for history's sake, and it wasn't just history to make sure that the history was correct around talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act, but it was to truly elevate the fact that there had been historic harm, but also that harm was still occurring, right? So there wasn't this sense as this working group was moving forward, or as the working group was transforming in its desire to think about truth, that there wasn't contemporary issues of disparate treatment and disproportionality. There were still children being removed at differential rates from different tribal communities across the state of Maine, and that was incredibly problematic, and was really suggesting that racism was still present within the context of the child welfare system. But so it wasn't just that there was a willingness to start to talk about history, but also a willingness to use history as a guide to start to think about changing policies in the contemporary moment, and to really start to stem those disparate impacts that were being faced by families and communities. So of course that's intertwined with compliance, in the sense that, are you complying with the mandates of the Indian Child Welfare Act? But it's so much more than compliance. So I think, that's one really great, or at least I guess I'll reframe that. I think that's great, right? I think that's one signpost, and arguably two signposts to thinking about how transformation was occurring, that we can see in very visible ways. I think a third is that simultaneous to undergoing a process of talking about harm and talking about history, policy changes were being made within the state of Maine. So legislatively, policy changes were starting to be made. In practice, changes were starting to be made. And I think that that really was coming out of the work during 2008, where Wabanaki child welfare workers were bringing forth this truth about the direct impact that this was having on children and families in a truly authentic and real voice, and that it was being listened to, again, not just as a compliance issue, but as a sense of humanity, of dignity, of what it meant to have cultural genocide occurring, and the lack of recognition of the sovereignty of the Wabanaki people.
Very interesting. Johanna here, Thalia, she says, hi, and can you talk more about Reach's understanding of decolonization? Very good question. How are they defining that concept and using it to guide the work of the gatherings you described? You know, these are loaded words for some people, and depending where you say them, they mean different things. So I'm wondering if you can help us think a little bit about how Reach defined decolonization and worked with it from there.
So, hi, Johanna, how are you? So I don't want to speak to that inappropriately, because I don't think that I can fully say, here's all the ways that they were framing decolonization, not just in the gatherings, the 3 years worth of gatherings that I had mentioned, but also in the work that they were doing during that time. What I will say is that they were approaching colonization through a unique and distinctly tribal lens, and through the lens of Native people. And in particular, that lens was through the history in Maine around colonization and appropriation, and then more importantly, the Indian boarding schools and the role that schools played in really decimating the cultural aspects. So if you saw the photo, right, and I think that that's so telling about colonization in Maine, right, you had the first photo that with the black and white that showed a young man in what would be considered a more traditional or native garb, and his hair and everything, to then a very sort of solemn, he's in a suit and his hair is cut, right? And so that idea of killing the man, so killing the Indian, saving the man. I apologize for that. And so to the extent that that's how I have understood their approach to decolonization and colonization, I think that's where I'd be willing to kind of position myself. Again, I think this is where, as a researcher, you don't always have the ability to stand in the shoes of others. And I am very careful to speak the truth or to tell the story of others where I don't feel like I can accurately do that.
Mm-hmm. All right, a question from Matt. Thank you, Thalia, again, for sharing this. In the truth-telling process, what have you found that helps minimize re-injury when telling the truth? In other words, while allowing the problem to be seen but not repeated, or how do you minimize the pain of those sharing as possible so that it doesn't hinder the healing? So maybe some, pragmatic responses there.
Absolutely. So I think that was one of the essential roles that Maine Wabanaki Reach. So all of the organizations, the organizations and individuals that were part of that coalition, is that they were going in before any type of truth-telling activity that was formal through the commission, and doing all of the prep work with individuals in the communities. So they were doing one-on-one meetings. They were doing listening circles with the whole community. They were doing that through a lens of resiliency. They were doing that through a lens, as I referenced, a particular lens that's around healing practices, indigenous practices, adverse childhood experiences. And so, they were doing all of that work and really ensuring that people were ready and comfortable. And in the instance that individuals did not want to have their names or other things that identified them, that was an assurance that was given, and it was absolutely followed. So there was no instance in where someone wanted anonymity that didn't happen. So I think that also, as this was occurring over time, people really gained a sense of trust. But you also have to remember that the members of Maine Wabanaki Reach are people that are in the community. It wasn't a new group of people that sort of showed up and came in and started saying, well, we're here we're here to help you. You know, these were Wabanaki people. These were child welfare workers in particular, so they were very much, it was their community. And so I think, again, that's important. But then I think the second part of your question, which was after truth-telling happened, how was harm minimized? The individuals that were part of Maine Wabanaki Reach, and I use that as the larger sort of heading without sort of parsing out individuals per se. They did healing circles, they did listening circles. So they were going through that process again. So it was then the process of individually within with individuals as one-on-ones or within the larger community, which is actually, I think, more profoundly impactful, ensuring that was happening. There were also listening circles that were happening across the state. So once the commission got their mandate, but before they even really started their work, there were state listening circles that occurred. So really to get that input into thinking about how this would unfold and what it might mean in terms of re-traumatization, and what it might mean to speak truth, and what it might mean to elevate all of these issues. And as I said, it was, you know, it also wasn't enough to just say, okay, truth is out there. Oh, we're sorry. But what are then all of those steps and those phases to then thinking about the grief that might come from that? And I think that's especially true when you're talking about the loss of children and families. And, you know, and I would say that given the way that Native peoples articulate how children are so fundamental within their social fabric, I think that that's so important, is that it's also that deeply personal issue that is shared not just among one person, but an entire community about the role that children play. Does that answer your question, Matt? I hope so.
I think that's great. Rachel jumps in here. Thank you, Thalia. I really enjoyed learning from you here. You mentioned the necessity of these types of commissions being local. Has this been replicated at all with other tribal nations throughout the country that we know of?
I'm not aware of any instance where this has been replicated. There was a discussion right after this commission finished its work about the possibility of this occurring in other instances. And there's certainly obviously a lot of amazing healing and peacemaking activities that are happening within Native communities across the country. But the formality of what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, no, it hasn't been replicated.
Sure.
And I think that part of that is that there's actually a lack of familiarity with what's happened in Maine. You know, Greensboro is obviously elevated, and people talk about the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission a lot and look to it as a model, but I don't always find that in those spaces that then the Maine Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission is also referenced. So as I said at the outset, like one of my goals in being able to be in this webinar is to illuminate this, right? Is to bring this into this larger discourse about historic harm, about racial justice, and about truth-telling.
That's fantastic. And of course, if we look at North America, Canada has a few examples. The Nova Scotia residential school truth-telling process, as well as their national process. And there's a lot of information on those processes on the web, and we would be happy to get some if folks would be interested in finding out more about those efforts. Doug here, was there a distinct Christian religious presence or participation in this process? And if so, was the church engaged? If not, how might you imagine the church being more present in future processes?
So I think I would probably turn that second half of the question to Carl, because I actually think that's something that he can speak to more fully, and sort of the role of the church and churches in that process. But I will say that in the context of the coalitional work and the grassroots work, that wasn't something that was happening in Maine. There just wasn't that as a presence and a role in that way. But I will pivot to Carl to sort of posit what that could look like.
Well, I feel I would have to respond to that in a very generalistic way, because I don't know what happened in Maine and who might have been.
I meant in a general way. Sorry, it wasn't to put you on the spot in that example, Carl.
But I would say in a very general way, part of this is about the church beginning to understand its role in the public space. And I think there's certainly plenty of theological as well as other justifications from the sacred text and the biblical text that would say the church has a role that it hasn't played in the public space around healing, around truth telling. These are not foreign ideas to the sacred text that those of us who would be in the church would claim we're walking with. And part of our problem is a dichotomous thinking that the church is doing something in a silo or separate or sort of spiritual bifurcation, and not seeing themselves as being necessarily part of the community and part of the society, and that the voice of the church is critical to speak truth to power. It's critical to speak to these issues of poverty, of oppression and violence, and needs to be there, I would argue. And it needs to move into the social contract, because the church is the community. The church is civil society, if they could see themselves that way. That's, in a very general sense, a challenge. But I would love to have more conversation around with you, Doug, in another place. Let's look at
the one thing I will add that your question was very specific, obviously, but I don't want to lose the fact that the American Friends Services Committee was actually a signatory to the Declaration of Intent, and they worked throughout the commission process to really ensure that they were supporting to bring tribes, state workers, the general public into this discourse because of their focus on equality and democracy and nonviolence. But I don't think that really was to your question. But I was like, I want to make sure though that I at least acknowledge that this Quaker-based organization and as a non-governmental organization played this role.
Two questions here from Lydia, so I might put them together a little bit. Lydia says, "Thank you so much, wonderful talk. Could you give a few examples?" And I think, if I'm understanding this question well, examples of what truth-telling activities might look like. So I think some of the more specifics, maybe pragmatics in the truth-telling, like how is the truth-telling actually going forward, if I understand that question. And she also asked, are there collected resources for implementing a process of this kind in our own communities? So I think are there reservoirs of places where people can find more resources, where they've been gathered in one place or not? And her second question, well, let's go with that. Go with that, Thalia, and we'll jump in with her second question.
Those two questions together. What else?
Well, her second question is related, but related to also some other questions, and it's a really good point. She says many of us are coming out of communities where there may not be a central historical harm that everyone can see and agree on in some form or another. In other words, a community's current marginalized state might be a result of decades of structural and less visible violence on communities of color. Is this process perhaps not appropriate in that case, or how might it change to reflect this condition, where there's multiple levels of structural violence and not sort of one process to focus on historically?
I mean, I would say that, that child welfare as sort of a named process might be more localized, but the structural racism that exists and the levels of subordination and perpetration of oppression are incredibly layered within the child welfare system and arguably within public systems generally. So I don't want to sort of discount what you're asking in that question, but I think that in communities that have faced marginalization for a whole intersectional and variable set of reasons, doesn't mean that there can't be a sense of collective identity around that. And sometimes that's just naming structural oppression and racism, like saying the word racism or saying the word sexism, right? Or from a more intersectional standpoint, as all of these things come together. And so, I think that there might be a challenge there in setting forth that collective identity, and you wouldn't necessarily have, quote, the ease, right, of naming the child welfare system and cultural genocide vis-a-vis the child welfare system. But I don't think that discounts the perpetration of harm based on structural racism, and more importantly, the perpetration of state violence against marginalized people. Black and brown people, women. I mean, all, I think, depending on, because I don't know the communities that you're speaking of or the community that you're speaking of very specifically, but, you know, state violence and the perpetration against bodies, I think is something that needs to be named and can be named. And that then there can be a collective understanding and sense of that. And I think it gets to my point about isolation, because someone might not necessarily view their experience, their family members' experience, or their family members' experience, sort of going back generationally, because we recognize that this is very intergenerational and it's historic, and that trauma is embedded in so many deep and layered ways, that there may just not have been that same language around it. But what is it now to capture it in language, to have a sense of shared identity, no longer in isolation, and just that naming process becomes very emancipatory. And so I think that's important. And I've totally forgotten, I think your first question in all of those questions was also resources. Like, is there a collective?
Describing the truth-telling activity. What did it actually look like, the processes?
And then also is there some sort of resource?
Yeah, resources that you could point our viewers to at all.
Sure. So there's two resources. So I'll jump in the middle question and then end with some examples of the truth-telling activities. So obviously the International Center on Transitional Justice has a lot of catalogs and information. Oh my God, I am so sorry. I'm unplugging my phone. This is the problem in being on leave and being in your office, and then someone realizes in your office. This is like the fourth time my phone's rang, and I'm not here normally. So the International Center for Transitional Justice has a lot of resources available on it, including information from Greensboro, including information from the Maine Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So if you're looking for sort of a jump in and start thinking about truth commissions, that's a great resource to do so. Bowdoin College actually has all of the archives and all of the documentation from the Maine Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's all publicly available. So if you're looking to learn more about this experience, I would direct you to their library collection. And again, I mean, I am so grateful, not just as a researcher, but as a person, right, that I have the ability to go into that website and to listen to the voices in totality, to understand the experiences that people had, right? I was not in the child welfare system. I'm not Wabanaki, right? So, you know, for me to be really sort of understanding this, not just from a theoretical standpoint, but from a very rich and real and humanistic standpoint about the indignity of what that is, being able to listen to people's voices, it's just a very different moment than reading it in a 90-page report, which it is, and it's there if you want it, but also just reading it in a transcript or something else. So I encourage you to kind of look at that as a resource. But to your first question in terms of what type of truth-telling activities, so I said first there were listening circles that were done in communities, so larger circles where individuals were ultimately sharing in that context. There were, and then there were an incredible number of interviews that were done. So there was a whole group of people that were identified by the commission and ultimately designated to interview throughout the state and throughout all of those months. And they did one-on-one interviews with a whole range of individuals. So people who were formerly in the child welfare system, people who were removed from their families, child welfare workers, both non-native and native child welfare workers, state policy decision makers. So really anybody and everybody that in that context might have had a touch point to that. But also then it wasn't limited to interviewing individuals who had a direct and immediate relationship with the child welfare system, because as I said before, there's something that, you know, Native people very clearly describe children in a unique and critical way, and where they're positioned within their understanding of community. And so, the initiative and the commission, it was open to anybody within the 5 Wabanaki communities to be able to share their stories and what this looked like. And I think that's important because then there were also these themes that really emerged. It wasn't, and I think those themes kind of speak to all of these issues in a more general way. Because if we start around child welfare, there were also these themes about tribal sovereignty, right? So as people were telling their stories in these individual one-on-one sessions, it wasn't just a story of removal, right, or of harm or of trauma in that way, but what it is to be thinking about tribal sovereignty and a lack of recognition as a people, and the colonization that occurred. So as I said before, Maine Wabanaki Reach really spent time going out and holding community events where they were just introducing people to the history of Maine, right? And to the history of the Wabanaki people and how people had moved freely back and forth between, Canada and Maine as we know them now. And there was never this understanding of these borders in this way and how people associated, and that there was diversity and richness, even as you talk about Wabanaki people. There were 5 Wabanaki chiefs that signed this in addition to the governor. So also it was ensuring that there was not a sense of homogeneity. So I know that's a bit off topic and what you asked, but I think that, the pragmatic truth-telling activities took those different forms, but so much of it took the form of literally just people being able to speak their truth and tell their story. And I think that's important. And obviously the commission, they reviewed, and they detailed this in the report, they reviewed all kinds of government documents and public documents and rates of removal. So all of the important data points, which I think speak truth, but may or may not, I think, resonate in that same way. Like you can look at disparate rates of removal and it might speak to you and you might see it in a really significant way, and then and be able to then articulate that in terms of cultural genocide or acknowledging that there's been a harm that's been done. But I think there's something fundamentally different about when people are allowed to speak their truth in that way. So I hope that answers your 4 questions.
I think that is great. And we're going to need to close up here soon, Thalia. There was 2 comments, and I want to give you a chance to say a few things from Monica Robinson and also Brenna Case. Were very around the language issue that you brought up, and just maybe a more specific question out of both of those would be, can you speak to specific examples of how the Maine Wabanaki process addressed some of the tensions, that most people spoke in English and not their native tongue? And so was there intentionality in addressing that in some form or another, or beyond the acknowledgement that you made?
Right. So, it's something that the commissioners really elevated, because it was not, no one was going to say to someone, you must speak in a particular language, right? I think that there was a hope, as people have written about it and thought about it, that that people would use native languages, but they didn't. And so, I think it's something that needs to be thought more deeply about within the community, and actually elevated. And I'm not in any way suggesting what should or shouldn't occur, but to take it out of the Wabanaki experience and put it into my own experience as someone who is bilingual in English and Spanish, how I might describe an experience in Spanish with certain words, especially experiences that came out of childhood where Spanish was very much embedded in my life, would just be different. But I'm not sure that in the moment of being asked to formally speak my truth, that I would feel comfortable doing it in Spanish at this point, right? I live and speak in English so often. And so I really wonder about the power dynamics of that. And so I think that if it's a lesson learned for us in other communities, is even where the best intentions of a cultural understanding, and that where you have a cross-cultural coalition and you have individuals who are working with such deep community roots, that there might still be that sense of tension around power. And there might still be that sense of tension around really authentically speaking your truth. And I think we just have to raise that and acknowledge that in all of these processes. And language is a great mask for that. And that if there were truth-telling activities in marginalized communities where English is not the dominant language or may not be someone's first language, how could you tease out that possibility for that to happen? And maybe that is about sort of front-end work that if, before someone is being interviewed, that's raised. Maybe that's raised in a circle practice, maybe that is a listening circle, for example, or maybe that's raised in a one-on-one, so that if in that moment someone feels that flexibility, or to shift back and forth between their language, and to know that that's okay, because that's not okay in most instances. I think about my daughter right now, who's 1, and we're raising her bilingually. I will be very interested to see what it's like when she hits school and she's using both languages, whether she will come home, as I came home when I felt that way, that I felt shamed about using Spanish. I did, right? And I didn't want to speak Spanish at school for that reason, because it was just not okay. And so I just wonder how in this truth-telling space we elevate that too, because that is an incredible form of marginalization that is not always talked about. So that was a bit of a divergence, and I apologize.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Thank you, Thalia. This was really good. I'm going to close with 2 comments. They're not really questions here, but just want to make them that were brought up here. Michelle Wright rightfully calls our attention to Charlottesville, where the clergy played a significant role. The churches helped to organize against the Unite the Right and the KKK rallies this past summer. And the clergy really stepped up and played a huge role there. And so there's one example of the church doing some significant work there on the front lines. Mishi says, please mention the Upstander project, followed by Maine Wabanaki TRC for over 2 years to document its process, and released a short film entitled First Light about it. And that there's a feature film, Dawnland, that will be released next year with a digital guide for teachers. So that's another resource out there for those who are listening to get hold of. I'm going to turn now back to Kajungu, has a few announcements around some of the activities that are happening here at the Center for Justice and Peace Building, and then we'll close up in a few minutes. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Carlo, and thank you for Thalia for sharing. I have only one announcement for this evening. Again, this is I just repeat the same announcement Carlo said at the beginning. I just want to emphasize: save the date for upcoming training. The topic will be Transformative Community Conference Training. The instructor will be David Anderson Hooker. I think most of you who attended the last webinar, you participate on his presentation. It was powerful. It will be February 16. It will be on Friday up to Saturday, February 17, 2018. It will be at Eastern Mennonite University here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Please visit our website for more information and registration. I just want to emphasize on that one announcement, and I want to take it back to Carlo for the close remarks. Thank you so much.
We did cut our announcements very short. Let me just say a few things. Please visit our website. You can see the past webinars and hear them. You can also find out more about this webinar series. Next month, Howard Zehr will be hosting 2 representatives from the Coming to the Table network around their model. And then in December, we'll be looking at a particular church-based, faith-based intervention at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond that is taking on a historical transformation of their connection to the Confederacy. And we'll be hearing from 2 of their congregants who will be talking about that process. Please also make your way to the Center for Justice and Peace Building's website, where there's a lot of information about our trauma coursework, as well as our Summer Peace Building Institute, as well as our graduate certificates and our newly rolled out MA this year in restorative justice. And we would encourage you to make use of that website and get in touch with us if you're interested in finding out more information. Thank you very much again, Dr. Thalia González, and this has been fantastic. I'm really happy we were able to put the spotlight on Maine Wabanaki's work, and I'm very impressed to find out what's been happening there. So thank you for giving your time and your energy and for your tireless work in advocacy around these issues, and your passion. It was evident. Thank you very much.
And thank you to everybody for joining. You know, I'm humbled to be able to share this with you. It's always so odd to not see everybody. So, you know, again, I thank the Institute, but I thank everyone for joining in this space. And again, I do encourage you to look more deeply at the Maine Wabanaki experience, and as importantly, I urge you to listen to the voices and to read the report of the Commission. You know, I am providing you an interpretive lens in some sense as a researcher, and I cannot replicate at all those voices, and I do not aim to speak for those voices and all those people involved. So, you know, please, if you're interested, I would encourage you to move forward. But thanks for your time.
All right, we hope you'll be joining us for next month's third Wednesday webinar with Howard Zehr and the Coming to the Table network. Thank you all, and have a good evening.